Welcome back, AP. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your flipped classroom and our continuing discussion of imperialism during the late 1800s, right? So we are now talking about two very, very essential parts of this unit, getting into the back end of the 1800s, talking about imperial growth of European powers during this time period, right? So like during the late 1800s. Now we were specifically like in class focusing on causes, motivations, like the reasons why, the differences, like all those kind of different things. Talking about how like imperialism and colonialism are two completely different things, right? Now after we combine together economic gain, pursuit of resources, pursuit of land for things like the Suez Canal by the British, right? When we also combine that together with like new technology, new weaponry, new transportation, new medicines coming out, and like the process of pasteurization, public health, Lister, and like the idea of antiseptics and new like medical techniques going on, we actually combine all that stuff together and we begin to realize that colonialism really is in the back window, right? Like colonialism really is old imperialism, if you're going to refer to it as being anything at all. So when we take all those new things together, a lot of times historians refer to this as new imperialism, right? New imperialism is the military takeover of these different areas for their resources, using this new weaponry and this new transportation, and using these new medicines to keep that military alive, right? Now, interesting thing about it, though, we talked about why quinine is like such an important thing, right? Quinine is an extremely important medicine that will tip the scales and give the ability to Europeans to go out there and take over more land than they ever have, right? Also imposing genocidal tendencies and then also killing native populations and also being pretty much some of the biggest jerks in all of history, right? Now, going into it, though, as well, we also have to understand that many European countries are beginning to like apologize for all of this stuff. For example, for those of you who are going to go to Amsterdam this summer, we're actually going to talk about that when we go see a very, very, really big site when they actually talks about their impetus in like Tanzania. All right, so now like going into it though, we need to also understand that new imperialism, quinine, stuff like that. Oh, by the way, fun fact as well for the parents, if you're actually listening in the background. Quinine also is the origin of the famous drink, the gin and tonic, right? Because they actually used to take tonic water, quinine, and gin and mix it all together, and they would use to drink quinine in their gin and tonics because it had a bad taste, right? But it's, of course, to avoid that malaria. Now, going into it, though, we now need to start talking about examples of imperialism that actually occurred throughout the late 1800s. We've been talking a lot about, like, motivations, nationalistic glory, social Darwinism, Mission Civil Strauss, White Man's Burden, like that like terrible, awful poem written by Rudyard Kipling, right, in the Jungle Book. But now going into it, though, imperialism is also going to be very, very heavily involved in what is known as the opening of Asia, quote unquote, right? Now, when we're looking at Asia and when we're looking in context of like Europe and their earliest attempts to go out and imperialize people, we have to understand that by the 1790s, Britain ain't got no money. Britain is very, very broke, right? Like they don't have a ton of money because they have a tea addiction. The Industrial Revolution is still very, very young. They've been in multiple different wars. The American Revolution has occurred, right? Now, they still appear strong on the outside, and they still have the world's largest navy, but they don't have a lot of economic liquidity like they actually want to, right? And then also, a big thing as well is a lot of homes in Britain are addicted to tea, right? They are actually addicted to tea, and you can actually see that with the American Revolution as well, because even American colonists at one point were pretty addicted to tea until they switched to coffee eventually, just because, you know, who needs that and who wants to be British? So going into it, though, you have to understand that this tea addiction is going to be a really big thing as well. Why was tea addiction such a big deal and then connected to the Industrial Revolution? Mostly due to the fact that you now have to stay awake for long hours and actually work inside of these factories, right? Now, when we're looking at where the tea comes from, when we're looking at the fact that, like, the average British household spent 10% of their income on tea alone, who is getting all the money from this tea? Well, it's none other than China, where this stuff is grown, right? China is not broke. They are not poor, and they are currently underneath the dynasty known as the Qing, all right? So like Qing, that is the ruling power in China at the time, right? The Qing dynasty, right? Now, the thing about it going into it we need to understand is China, as you can tell, was economically advanced, right? Was prosperous, was culturally deep, was actually also pretty much like when you really look at it, had been ahead of the times for hundreds of years by comparison to Europeans, right? Now, when we look at the monsoon marketplace and what was going on during the Middle Ages, when Asiatic kingdoms were advancing and developing different types of science, they were selling silk and all these different precious items, they were actually very, very, very much advanced or on par with the Europeans at the time. Now, something happened in about like the 1500s, 1600s, where things began to change and Europeans started to gain certain advantages that the Chinese never seemed to like actually really look at with any kind of importance, right? The Chinese were always like, well, we don't want to invest money in that because it just seems silly, right? And so going into it, you have to understand they made all their money through trade, and they also kept a very traditional style culture, right? They made their money through porcelain sales, silk sales, tea sales, luxury items that the Europeans had no access to, right? And they also were economically closed, right? Like something we need to understand about being closed, right? Most Asian countries at this time, including China, Japan, so you have to understand that they were what is known as being a closed shop, right? So what that means is that they actually did not trade directly to other countries, right? Chinese envoys did not go out and then send boats to Great Britain to sell that tea and then pick up items and then bring it back because, quite frankly, the Chinese didn't want anything that the British have. They were just like, oh, we're good. The only thing they ever wanted was like maybe silver or gold or just something like that. Just like, currency, money, like things like that. But they have people coming to them. So that's a big part of this closed system. The other people in this system came to them, right? Like they all came to them. And there was one city that they could go to in China called Canton, right? And in Canton, that is the one location that British traders were allowed to go and pick up that tea, right? And so this kept China protected economically, it kept them protected militarily, and it kept them protected for a long time, creating what is known as economic isolationism or economic isolation, okay? So going into it, you also need to understand, though, that what the British are going to come up with an idea to do is one of the most awful and dastardly things you've ever heard of in your entire existence. The British are trying to figure out an item that the Chinese don't have, that they can actually maybe possibly trade them one-to-one for tea, right? They're like, what did they not have? Like, what did they not have? They don't want any of our stuff. They don't want, fish and chips. They don't want, a meat pie. Like, they don't want any of that stuff, right? They don't want any of our iron because they have, some of their own, right? What do they want from us? What can we provide them to trade them for that tea, take it back to England, and sell it for a fat profit, right? Well, some British traders that have gone to Canton have begun to hear about how there's this one substance that the Chinese have banned a long time ago and that they do not allow in their society. And this is when the British light bulbs turned on and the devil horns began to grow because it's absolutely ridiculous that they did this, right? They decided to trade the Chinese opium for tea straight up, right? Now, for those of you who don't know what that means, now, opium is a drug, all right? So opium is the same drug that actually makes heroin, all right? So now, opium is also the same drug that makes prescription-based opiate painkillers like oxycodone, which caused an actual opiate epidemic crisis in the United States of America that's still happening, right? It's called the opioid crisis, right? You have to understand, though, that this stuff is highly illegal in China at the time because China was like, this is the one thing we don't like due to the fact that when you take opium, you fall asleep, you enter into a state of depressed euphoria, right? Not depressed like sad euphoria, but depressed like depressant euphoria, right? And you don't work, right? And you don't do anything, and you don't really contribute to society. So they banned it for a long time. They were like, if we catch you with this stuff, you'll be arrested, possibly executed, right? Well, the British are like, well, you know what? We've got India. How about we just grow it over there, process the opium, and then give it to the Chinese traders out in the water. We won't even go to China. We'll give it out and give it to them out in the water. And they did this and then took that tea back to Britain and sold it for a profit. And remember, opium is stupid illegal in China. Stupid illegal. So really quickly, let's just kind of take a little toll for what's going on right now. The British are selling drugs to get tea. Now, some of you might argue and be like, well, caffeine's a drug. I think that's a false equivalency, and you need to shut it. Now, because that is absolutely ridiculous. You're trading drugs to a society to destabilize their economy and their infrastructure. Also, you can have tea, right? Because this is what's going to begin to pop up all over China and stuff like that as they begin to actually do this. They're called opium dens, right? And by the way, when you get opium out of the poppy plant, that's where it actually comes from. poppies, like poppy seeds on a bagel, that's actually where opium comes from, right? You actually wait until before it blooms, you score the bulb, and that stuff right there is opium before it's actually been processed, right? Now, going into it, you need to understand that what's going to happen after this is a set of these things known as the Opium Wars, because the Chinese are going to take high offense to this, right? Now, when you're looking at history, you would think that this is going to be a really even fight, right? Like, this is going to be a really even fight, also because the Chinese outnumber the British like 6-1, you know what I mean? Like, so now, the Opium Wars, right, there's going to be the first one and the second one. They last from 1839 to 1860, right? And the cause of this, of course, is British greed, right? Like, so, like, now, also, there's this story about seized chests, right? There was this guy named Lao Tzu that actually, not Lao Tzu, there's another guy, I got to look him up. Lao Tzu invented Taoism. That's a different thing. So there was a Chinese admiral that actually was told by the Qing emperor to go out there and figure out a way to stop all this opium from coming in. And so what he decided to do is he would seize it at the ports, right? And opium came in these big chests, right? And he one time seized 21,000 chests of this opium, and then he threw it all into the water and also burned a bunch of it on the beaches. And the British are going to be like, oh, well, you owe us money for all that drugs that you just destroyed. And the Chinese admiral and the government are like, no, we're not going to do that. You're a jerk. Heck no. And so they actually literally end up, the British, to get their money back for the destroyed drugs, start a war. And that was the start of the very first Opium War, right? And now the British in the very first Opium War totally overwhelmed the Chinese, even though they were outnumbered, okay? It was a 6,000 fighting force to 50,000 British, right? That's actually, or excuse me, 50,000 Chinese. That's actually almost a ratio of 10 to 1. Now, also, as well, is that the Chinese tried to take, like, really peaceful tactics to try and avoid this war as well. Like, this right here is a letter that actually was sent to Queen Victoria at the time from the Qing Emperor saying, please stop selling drugs inside of our country. And apparently she just never got the letter, quote unquote. Like, you know, if I send an email and you're like, oh, I never got that, quote unquote, that's literally what ended up happening, all right? So, like, you have to understand is that the Chinese tried to avoid this entire time, right? The second Opium War was started because this whole thing with bread. Apparently, there was a very large bakery in, like, China, and they sent bread, like, all over the world, and some of the bread ended up in Great Britain, and it had arsenic in it. Like, so, yeah, and I mean, like, if you're selling drugs to their people, I can see why they might do that. So, like, now, going into it, though, you have to understand that will push the second Opium War. But in both of them, the British handily beat the Chinese armies, right? And a lot of it has to do with the fact that the British were very militarily trained. They had very, very advanced technologies, including actually steam-powered vessels, steam-powered boats, and then also they had as well this famous thing known as the HMS Nemesis, right? This thing terrified and shocked the Chinese armies, right? This thing was a steam-powered vessel, Navy warship, that actually was loaded down with cannons and could bombard Chinese cities from the water, right? And so going into it, you have to understand that this is also right here a great picture of what the Chinese military looked like. Some Chinese soldiers were still running into this battle with bows and arrows and swords, while the British are actually using breech-loading rifles, right? Which is going to give them the ability to fire 6 shots to one, or like by a Chinese musketeer, right? Now, the thing that ends up happening, though, is after the Chinese lose this war, it's the very first set of these things known as the unequal treaties comes out, right? So what ends up happening is other Europeans piggyback off of this, right? Following the first Opium War, when the British actually opened up China, quote unquote, right, and forced them to begin to trade directly with the British, right, they actually are going to see people like France, Russia, Germany get involved in the second Opium War, and they're actually going to jump into these unequal treaties. And these treaties would actually, like, basically screw over the Chinese, and the Europeans would gain completely from it. And what it did is it actually established these things known as spheres of influence in China. And what a sphere of influence is if you look at this map of China, you basically have, like, all this, look at your color code down here, right? British ports were located right here around Shanghai and the Yellow River, right? And then you also have German ports, which were located right here up near Shandong, right? And then you also have French ports, which is going to be down here towards French Indochina, which is now modern-day Vietnam, right? So these spheres of influence were like if you took a big, like, see-through glass dome, and if you just dropped it on top of each of these cities, and each of those domes belonged to a European power, right? The Japanese actually are going to take over some area as well, which is going to be a really, really interesting thing that actually we're going to talk about here in about 2 seconds. And the Russians are even going to get involved, especially in Mongolia and in northern China, known as Manchuria, right? And what a lot of Chinese historians and what a lot of Chinese people referred to this as was the century of humiliation, right? Because for the next 100 years, it's going to lead to a process where Europeans are going to use their technologies to basically overthrow, destroy, and like catastrophically crush Chinese culture and tradition, right? So going forward as well, what we need to understand is there's going to be another time that this happens, and it happens in Japan, right? Now, the Japanese version of imperialism is a little bit different, right? Because Japan was isolated just like China was, right? Like they were heavily isolated, but what's going to happen is an American is going to show up, a guy named Matthew Perry. Not Matthew Perry from Friends, different guy, R.I.P. So, like, now what ends up happening, though, is gunboat diplomacy takes force because this guy named Commodore Matthew Perry, or not Commodore, that's British, Admiral Perry, shows up with a very large American steam-powered warship, right? And he basically tells the Japanese government, you can have what happened to China happen to you. All right, so yeah, if you do not open these ports, right? They basically said, we will be back in a year, open your ports, or else we will go full-blown war, right? And the Japanese were not ready to fight a full-blown war. They had actually been having multiple different civil wars because of the shogunate period and the Tokugawa period that actually was happening inside of their actual country. And so Japan was faced with a very different choice, and they chose to modernize, right? What ends up happening here is this thing known as the Meiji Restoration, right? They actually appoint a new emperor known as Emperor Meiji, and they, instead of actually entering into a fight or a battle with European powers, they chose to modernize, right? And the Meiji Restoration lasted from 1868 to 1931, and it led to massive industrialization and the creation of a new Western-style military inside of Japan. And what that will lead them to do is emulating and imitating the Europeans, and they go out and start imperializing people. They go out and start buying European weapons from Europeans and using them, and then also buying European technologies to modernize themselves, right? And that right there is your flip, and we'll talk about that a little bit more when I see y'all in class.